We're a team, Meredith. Everyone knows you're part of this. Garrett's voice was gentle, patient, the kind of patience you use with someone who's being unreasonable. Meredith Hayes Sullivan sat across from her husband at their kitchen table, the advance copy of his book between them like evidence at a trial. Her hands were folded in her lap. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't crying. She was doing something far more dangerous than either of those things. She was watching, listening, recording every word in the part of her mind that had started keeping score. Then why doesn't the book say that? She asked quietly. Garrett sighed, not angry, just disappointed, like she was missing something obvious. Because that's not how publishing works. The market needs a clear voice, a single author, you know this. She did know this. She knew a lot of things. But knowing and accepting were becoming two very different territories. What Garrett didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know as he sat there explaining the realities of the industry to her, was that Meredith had already made a decision. Not the decision to fight, not yet, but the decision to remember, to document, to wait. Because silence, she was learning, could be a strategy, and patience could be a weapon. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The book had arrived on a Tuesday. Meredith had been expecting it. Garrett had mentioned the advance copies were coming, had been excited in that boyish way he got when things were going well for him. For them, he'd say. For us? She'd made coffee that morning the way she always did. She'd worked on her own writing, a research paper she was developing under her maiden name, though Garrett didn't pay much attention to that work. It was academic, which in his vocabulary meant interesting but not particularly important. Not the kind of thing that moved the needle. The package arrived just before lunch. Garrett opened it at the kitchen counter, and the sound he made was pure joy. He held up the book, glossy cover, his name in bold letters, the subtitle promising to revolutionize how organizations think about culture and transformation. It's beautiful, he said. It's really beautiful. Meredith walked over, took the book from his hands, ran her fingers over the cover. Organizational Transformation, a New Framework for Sustainable Change. By Garrett Sullivan. Just his name. Only his name. Congratulations, she said, and she meant it. At least, part of her meant it. We should celebrate, Garrett said, already pulling out his phone to text his agent, his publisher, the clients who'd been waiting for this. This is big, Mer. This is the thing that's going to establish the methodology, make it permanent. The methodology. She didn't correct the possessive pronoun. She'd stopped correcting it months ago. Instead, she took the book to the living room and began to read. By page 15, Meredith's hands had gone cold. By page 30, she'd stopped breathing normally. By page 60, she understood exactly what had happened, and the understanding sat in her chest like a stone. Every major concept in the book was hers, not adapted from her work, not built on her contributions, not inspired by their conversations. Hers, verbatim. Frameworks she'd developed years before meeting Garrett. Models she'd stayed up until 3 a.m. refining while he slept. Case study methodologies she'd designed and tested and documented. The language was different. Garrett had a gift for making complex ideas accessible, for translating her dense academic frameworks into compelling business narratives. She'd always admired that about him. She'd thought of them as partners. She was the architect, he was the translator. But translation implied that both roles were acknowledged, that both people were visible in the final product. This wasn't translation, this was replacement. She kept reading. Chapter 4, Her Framework for Understanding Power Dynamics in Organizational Change. She'd published an early version of this under her maiden name, 3 years before meeting Garrett. She had the journal article to prove it. Chapter 7, Her Model for Identifying Resistance Patterns. She'd developed this during her doctoral work. It was stamped with her thinking so completely that she could remember the exact coffee shop where she'd sketched the first diagram. Chapter 9, Her Approach to Measuring Cultural Transformation. She'd walked Garrett through this methodology last year, step by step, because a client had asked him a question he couldn't answer. All of it was there. All of it was presented as his thinking, his breakthrough, his innovative approach. She turned to the acknowledgments page. Surely here. Surely this was where. I'm grateful to many people who supported the development of this work, my agent, Linda Torres, for believing in this project, my editor, David Chen, for pushing me to clarify. My thinking, my assistant Jennifer Park for keeping everything organized, and the many colleagues and clients who challenged and refined these ideas through our conversations. Special thanks to my wife Meredith, who keeps the home fires burning while I pursue this mission. Meredith read it 3 times. She was grouped with the assistant and the editor. A collective acknowledgement, vague and generic. The many colleagues. And that last line, that devastating last line, who keeps the home fires burning while I pursue this mission. As if her role was domestic support. As if she'd been home baking bread while Garrett was out in the world doing the important intellectual work. As if she hadn't created the very foundations his entire career was built on. She didn't throw the book. She didn't scream. She didn't storm into the kitchen where Garrett was on the phone with someone, laughing about early sales projections. Meredith Hayes Sullivan did something that would have looked like nothing to anyone watching. She set the book down carefully on the coffee table. She stood up. She walked to her office, the small room at the back of the house that Garrett called Meredith's space, as if the rest of the house was his. She opened her laptop. She created a new folder, and she titled it Documentation. She waited until that evening to say anything. They were having dinner, takeout from the place they always ordered from on Tuesdays. Garrett was still buzzing with excitement, talking about the book launch strategy, the media interviews being scheduled, the speaking opportunities this would create. I read the book, Meredith said. And? Garrett leaned forward, eager. What did you think? I recognized a lot of the frameworks. Of course you did. You've been part of the development process. You know this work inside and out. There it was again. Part of the development process. Not the originator, not the creator. Part of the chapter on power dynamics, Meredith said carefully. That's the framework I published in 2019, before we met. Garrett nodded, not seeing the problem. Right? And we've built on that together, extended it, made it applicable to real-to-world situations. But the book doesn't mention that I developed the original framework. He paused, fork halfway to his mouth. Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt, but confusion. Like he genuinely didn't understand why this mattered. Mayor, the book is written for a general business audience, not academics. I can't include footnotes and citations for every conversation we've had or paper you've written. That's not how this kind of book works. I'm not talking about footnotes. I'm talking about basic attribution. Acknowledgement that these aren't entirely your original ideas. The word your landed harder than she'd intended. Garrett set down his fork. They're our ideas. We're a team. We've built this together. Then why is only your name on the cover? There. She'd said it. The question that had been sitting in her throat since she opened the package. Garrett was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his tone had changed. Still patient, but with an edge underneath. The edge that appeared whenever she questioned anything about how he ran the business, how he presented the work, how he'd structured their professional partnership. Because that's what the publisher wanted. They wanted a clear brand, a single voice. We talked about this, remember? When I first signed the contract? Meredith didn't remember that conversation, or rather, she remembered Garrett mentioning that he'd been offered a book deal, and she'd been happy for him. For them. But she didn't remember agreeing to sole authorship. She didn't remember being asked. The book benefits both of us, Garrett continued. It's going to grow the business, bring in bigger clients, increase our revenue. Our revenue, Meredith, we share everything. Except credit. The words came out before she could stop them. Garrett's face did something complicated. Hurt, then defensive, then something else. Something that looked almost like calculation. Is that what this is about? Credit? Recognition? He said the words like they were vaguely distasteful. I thought you were above that. You've always said you didn't care about being in the spotlight, that you preferred working behind the scenes. And there it was. The trap she'd built for herself with every deflection. Every time she'd said she didn't need recognition. Every moment she'd stepped back to let Garrett shine. I don't need to be in the spotlight, Meredith said quietly. But I do need to exist in the story. You do exist. Everyone who knows us knows you're essential to the work. Who's everyone? Your clients? The people who hire you specifically to hear Garrett Sullivan's methodology? The journalists who profile you as a solo visionary? Meredith. The award committee that nominated you, just you, for pioneering contributions you couldn't have made without my frameworks? She hadn't meant to bring up the award. That was supposed to be good news. Garrett had been nominated for a Lifetime Achievement Award in Organizational Development, and when he'd told her about it last month, she'd celebrated with him. But now, looking at this book, this comprehensive erasure of her intellectual authorship, the award felt different. It felt like the final seal on a narrative that had been slowly rewritten over years. Garrett stood up. I can't believe you're doing this. I share the most exciting professional news of my career, and you're turning it into an attack. You're trying to diminish something I've worked incredibly hard for. I'm not trying to diminish anything. I'm trying to be seen. You are seen, by me, every single day. I tell you how brilliant you are, how much I value your thinking. In private, you tell me in private. But in public, I'm your wife who keeps the home fires burning. Garrett's jaw tightened. That was a nice acknowledgement. I was honoring the fact that you support what I do. What you do? Garrett, half the ideas in that book came from my mind, not from our conversations, from my research, my frameworks, my years of work before I ever met you. And I've made them accessible. I've taken academic concepts and turned them into something that actually helps people. Do you know how many organizations are going to benefit from this work? How many people are going to be able to create better cultures because I found a way to explain these ideas in language they can understand? He wasn't wrong. Garrett was exceptional at translation, at taking her dense theoretical frameworks and turning them into compelling stories and practical tools. She'd always valued that. But somewhere along the way, translation had become transformation, and transformation had become ownership. I'm not saying your contribution isn't valuable, Meredith said. I'm saying mine should be acknowledged too. It is acknowledged. You're in the acknowledgements. Grouped with your assistant. Jesus Christ, Meredith. Garrett ran his hand through his hair. When did you become so concerned with status? So competitive? This isn't like you. And there it was. The final move in the dance. The problem wasn't that he'd erased her from the narrative. The problem was that she was being petty enough to notice. The problem wasn't his appropriation of her work. The problem was her sudden need for recognition. The problem somehow was her. I'm not being competitive, Meredith said. I'm asking for basic professional acknowledgement of intellectual contribution. In a marriage, we don't keep score about who thought of what first. We're partners. Everything we do is shared. Is it? Because your name is the only one on the cover. Your name is the only one clients know. Your name is the only one getting the award. Garrett looked at her like he didn't recognize her. What do you want from me, Meredith? Do you want me to call the publisher and tell them to pull the book? Do you want me to decline the award? Do you want me to sabotage everything we've built because you suddenly decided you need your name in lights? The accusations landed like punches. Sabotage. Suddenly decided, name in lights. As if wanting to be acknowledged for work she'd done was vanity. As if asking for credit was destruction. Meredith felt something inside her go very still. This was the boundary. This was the line she couldn't come back from. Because Garrett genuinely believed what he was saying. She could see it in his face. He'd told himself the story of his own genius so many times that he'd forgotten, or perhaps had never truly known, where his ideas ended and hers began. He'd lived inside the public narrative for so long that it had become his private reality. And if she pushed further, if she kept insisting on the truth, she would become the villain in his story. The jealous wife. The competitive partner. The person who couldn't be happy for his success. I don't want you to sabotage anything, Meredith said quietly. I don't want you to pull the book or decline the award. She watched relief flood Garrett's face. I just wanted you to see me, she continued. To acknowledge what I contributed. To understand why being erased from work I created might be painful. Garrett softened. He came around the table, put his hands on her shoulders. I do see you. I see you every day, and I'm sorry if the acknowledgement felt insufficient. I'll do better next time, okay? We'll make sure you're more prominently mentioned in future projects. He kissed the top of her head. We're a team, he said again. Don't forget that. Then he went back to his phone, back to his messages, back to his celebration, and Meredith stood in the kitchen, understanding three things with perfect clarity. 1. Garrett would never voluntarily acknowledge her authorship, because doing so would require him to dismantle the story he'd built about himself. 2. Any future mentions would be token gestures, breadcrumbs designed to keep her quiet while the fundamental erasure continued. 3. If she wanted the truth to be told, she would have to tell it herself. But not now. Not like this. Not in anger or hurt, or the desperate need to be seen by someone who had trained himself not to look. She would wait. She would prepare. She would build a case so comprehensive, so meticulously documented, that the truth would be undeniable. And when the moment was right, when the stakes were highest, when Garrett's reputation was at its peak, she would show the world exactly whose ideas had built his empire. That night, while Garrett slept peacefully beside her, Meredith lay awake and began planning. Not revenge. She didn't want to hurt him. Despite everything, she didn't want to hurt him. But she wanted something more fundamental than revenge. She wanted to exist in the record. She wanted her contributions to be acknowledged. She wanted the truth to be told. She wanted to be visible. And if Garrett couldn't give her that, if the only way to reclaim her identity was to step out of the shadows he'd kept her in, then she would do what she'd spent a decade not doing. She would choose herself. The next morning, Meredith started her own quiet project. She went through old emails, looking for the first time she'd articulated each framework, each model, each approach that appeared in Garrett's book. She found them, messages from years ago, some from before she'd even met him. I've been thinking about power dynamics and organizational change, and here's a framework I'm developing. She pulled her old journals from graduate school, where she'd sketched early versions of concepts that now appeared, polished and popularized, under Garrett's name. She located her published papers, work that existed in academic databases under Hayes-M or Whitmore Hayes-M, and created a comparison document showing the direct lineage between her scholarship and Garrett's commercial applications. She didn't do this in anger. She did it with the methodical care of someone building a legal case. Because that's what this was, in a way. A case for her own existence. Over the following weeks, as Garrett's book launch approached and media interviews piled up, Meredith lived two lives. In one life, she was the supportive wife. She attended the launch party, smiled for photos, accepted congratulations from people who called her Garrett's better half, and told her she must be so proud. She was proud, she told them. She was. In the other life, the one that existed in the quiet hours, in the early mornings before Garrett woke, in the space of her own mind, she was Meredith Hayes, not Meredith Sullivan, not Garrett's wife, not the woman behind the man, just herself. The person who'd spent years developing ideas that were now making someone else famous. She started publishing again under her maiden name. Small academic papers at first, in journals Garrett didn't read, work that extended beyond the frameworks he'd popularized, that went deeper and more theoretical. The academic community started to notice. A few researchers reached out asking about her thoughts on the Sullivan method. She responded carefully, "We've collaborated extensively. The commercial applications are his strength." It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. Not yet. 6 months after the book launch, Garrett came home with more news. "I've been invited to give a keynote at the Global Leadership Summit," he said, pulling her into a hug. "Do you know how big this is? 5,000 attendees. It's going to be streamed to another 20,000 people. This is the platform, Mer. This is what takes everything to the next level." Meredith hugged him back and felt absolutely nothing. No pride, no resentment, no anger, no love. Just a strange, distant observation, "He still doesn't see me." "That's wonderful," she said. And she meant it the same way you might mean, "That's wonderful," when someone tells you about a beautiful sunset you weren't present for. Factually true. Emotionally empty. That night, she added the keynote announcement to her documentation folder. She was up to 200 pages now. Emails, papers, dated documents, comparative analyses, a comprehensive timeline showing exactly when each idea had originated, who had developed it, and how it had migrated from her research to Garrett's presentations. She didn't know yet what she would do with all this documentation, but she knew she would need it. Because Garrett's success was accelerating, and with each new platform, each new interview, each new opportunity, the narrative was being set more firmly. He was the visionary. He was the innovator. He was the brilliant mind who'd revolutionized organizational development. And she was the wife who kept the home fires burning. "Do you ever feel invisible?" The question came from Janine, Meredith's oldest friend, over lunch on a random Thursday. Meredith looked up from her salad. "What do you mean?" "I don't know, it's just... When I hear Garrett talk about his work, I remember the conversations we used to have back in grad school, when you'd tell me about your frameworks, your research, and I hear him present those exact ideas and your name is never mentioned. Meredith's chest tightened. We collaborate. It's complicated. Is it? Or have you just gotten used to being erased? The word landed like a slap. Erased. That's what it was, wasn't it? Not overlooked. Not underappreciated. Erased. He credits me privately, Meredith said. But even as she said it, she wasn't sure it was true anymore. Janine leaned forward. Mare, I love you. And I'm saying this because I love you, you're disappearing. When we talk, half your sentences start with Garrett thinks or Garrett says. When I ask about your work, you deflect. When I bring up your old research, you change the subject. I'm focused on different things now. Are you? Or have you just learned to make yourself smaller so he can be bigger? Meredith felt tears prick her eyes and hated herself for it. I'm fine, she said. Janine looked at her with something that might have been pity, or might have been recognition. Okay, but if you ever stop being fine, if you ever want to take up space again, I'm here. That conversation haunted Meredith for weeks. Take up space again, as if she'd voluntarily relinquished it, as if she'd chosen to become invisible. But had she? Or had she just participated in her own erasure so consistently for so long that everyone, including herself, had forgotten she was supposed to be visible? The turning point came 14 months after Garrett's book was published. Meredith received an email from a journal editor she respected, asking if she'd be interested in presenting at an international conference on organizational psychology. The invitation was based solely on her published work under her maiden name, work the selection committee found theoretically rigorous and practically significant. They had no idea she was connected to Garrett Sullivan. For the first time in years, Meredith felt something like hope. She accepted the invitation. She spent 2 months preparing a presentation that went deep into the theoretical foundations of collaborative knowledge creation, the academic underpinnings of everything Garrett had popularized. She didn't mention him. She didn't mention their marriage. She presented as Dr. Meredith Hayes, independent researcher. The response was extraordinary. People in the audience recognized immediately that her framework was the foundation beneath the Sullivan method. They asked smart questions. They wanted to know more. They treated her like a serious scholar rather than someone's supportive wife. After the presentation, a university press editor approached her. Would you be interested in writing a book, a serious academic text exploring these frameworks in depth? Meredith heard herself say yes before she'd fully processed the question. A book. Under her name. In her voice. Not a translation of her ideas. Not a popularization. The real thing. The deep thing. The work that was actually hers. We'd publish it under your full name, the editor said. Dr. Meredith Hayes. Though I noticed some of your earlier publications use Whitmore Hayes. Hayes is fine, Meredith said. Just Hayes. She was reclaiming her maiden name, reclaiming the identity that existed before devotion had erased it. And in that moment, standing in a conference center 3,000 miles from home, Meredith understood something fundamental. She'd been waiting for Garrett to see her, to acknowledge her, to give her permission to exist in their shared story. But permission wasn't something she needed to wait for. She could just take up space, exist, be visible, not as his wife, not as his collaborator, as herself. When she returned home, Garrett barely noticed she'd been gone. How was the conference? He asked absently, focused on his laptop. Good. They invited me to write a book. That's nice, honey. He didn't ask what the book was about, didn't ask who the publisher was, didn't ask anything, and Meredith realized this was the relationship. This was the pattern. His work was important, world-changing, worth celebrating. Her work was nice. She'd accepted this dynamic for so long that it had become invisible, normal, just the way things were. But now, having experienced what it felt like to be taken seriously by people who didn't know her as Garrett's wife, having felt the dignity of being recognized for her actual thinking, the imbalance was suddenly unbearable. I'm going to use my maiden name for the book, she said. Okay? Garrett still wasn't really listening. And I'm going to explore the theoretical foundations of organizational transformation frameworks, the academic side. Sounds great. He had no idea what she was really saying, that she was building an independent professional identity, creating a body of work that existed entirely separate from him, establishing credibility that didn't depend on his recognition. He had no idea she was preparing to leave. Not the marriage. Not yet. But the story. His story. The narrative where she was a supporting character in his triumph. She was writing herself out of his script and into her own. And when the time came, when everything was in place, she would show him exactly what he'd lost by refusing to see what he'd had all along. Script writing, Part 2. Over the next 18 months, Meredith lived in two worlds that never touched. In one world, she was Meredith Sullivan, wife of Garrett Sullivan, the acclaimed organizational development expert. She attended his speaking engagements, smiled in photographs at industry events, played the role of supportive partner with increasing detachment. People at these events often told her how lucky she was, how inspiring it must be to be married to such a visionary. She thanked them and said nothing else. In the other world, she was Dr. Meredith Hayes, scholar and researcher, building a reputation in academic circles that valued intellectual rigor over commercial appeal. Her published papers were dense, theoretical, meticulously argued. They appeared in journals Garrett never read, cited by researchers he'd never heard of. This world didn't care about keynote presentations or bestseller lists. It cared about original thinking, properly attributed, carefully documented. The two worlds ran parallel, never intersecting, and Meredith inhabited both with a psychological flexibility that sometimes frightened her. She was becoming someone who could perform devotion while feeling nothing. Someone who could smile at Garrett across the dinner table while mentally reviewing the documentation folder that now exceeded 400 pages. Someone who could say I love you and mean only I remember loving you once, before I understood what you were doing. The cognitive dissonance should have broken her. Instead, it sharpened her. She learned to compartmentalize in ways she'd never imagined possible. At Garrett's book events, she was gracious and warm. At academic conferences under her maiden name, she was rigorous and assertive. The two versions of herself existed in completely separate containers, and she was meticulous about never letting them bleed together. Not yet. The academic book took her a year to write. Every evening after Garrett went to sleep, she worked on it. Chapter by chapter, she laid out the theoretical foundations of organizational transformation, the psychological principles underlying cultural change, the research methodologies for measuring sustainable shifts in collective behavior. Everything Garrett's book touched on superficially, hers explored in depth. Every framework he'd popularized, she traced back to its intellectual origins, citing the research that informed it, including her own earlier publications. She never mentioned him by name. She didn't have to. Anyone familiar with the Sullivan method would recognize the foundations immediately. The book was published by a university press under the title Theoretical Foundations of Organizational Transformation, authored by Dr. Meredith Hayes. It was not a commercial success. It sold maybe 2,000 copies, mostly to libraries and graduate programs. But in academic circles, among people who shaped the field rather than popularized it, the book was recognized as significant, rigorous, foundational. Several reviewers noted, carefully, that the theoretical framework bore striking resemblance to popular methodologies in the commercial sector, but with far greater sophistication and deeper research grounding. One reviewer wrote, Hayes provides the intellectual architecture that others have built accessible structures upon, often without proper attribution to the original engineering. Meredith read that review 3 times and felt something close to vindication. Someone saw it. Someone understood. She was becoming visible, slowly, in the places that mattered for establishing credibility. Not fame, but legitimacy. Not celebrity, but authority. And authority, she was learning, was a kind of power Garrett had never given her credit for understanding. Garrett, for his part, never read her book. He congratulated her when it was published, in the same vague way he'd congratulated her on the conference presentation. Nice work, honey. I'm proud of you. He didn't ask what it was about, didn't request a copy, didn't show any curiosity about what she'd spent a year writing. This no longer hurt Meredith. It simply confirmed what she'd already come to understand. He didn't see her as an intellectual equal. He saw her as support staff with a PhD, useful for refining his ideas, irrelevant as an independent thinker. The erasure was so complete that he couldn't even perceive what was happening right in front of him. Meredith was building a professional identity entirely separate from their marriage, and Garrett noticed nothing, because he'd never really been paying attention. Through her academic work, Meredith developed relationships with people who became important to her in ways Garrett's colleagues never had. These were scholars who engaged with ideas for their own sake, who valued precision and attribution, who understood that intellectual work had origins and authors. Some of them asked about her connection to Garrett Sullivan. The similarities between her theoretical frameworks and his commercial methodology were too obvious to ignore. Meredith's answer was always the same, delivered with careful neutrality. We've collaborated extensively over the years. He has a gift for making complex ideas accessible to business audiences. The popularization is his strength. It was technically true. It was also incomplete in ways that protected her until she was ready to tell the complete story. A few of the sharper academics pressed further. One of them, a researcher named Patricia Chen, who specialized in knowledge attribution and collaborative authorship, asked directly during a coffee meeting at a conference. The frameworks in Sullivan's work, the theoretical underpinnings, they're your research, aren't they? The original work is yours. Meredith had looked at Patricia for a long moment. Then she'd said, "That's a complicated question." Patricia had nodded slowly. "When you're ready to uncomplicate it, I'd be very interested in hearing that story." The conversation stayed with Meredith. Because Patricia was right. The story was complicated only because Meredith was protecting Garrett's narrative. The facts themselves were simple. She'd originated the frameworks. He'd presented them as his own. The complication was her silence. And silence, she was beginning to understand, was a choice she didn't have to keep making. Her documentation had become extraordinarily comprehensive. She had time-stamped emails showing her articulation of concepts months and years before Garrett used them publicly. She had early drafts of frameworks in her handwriting, dated and preserved. She had her published papers from before their marriage, showing clear lineage of ideas. She had recordings of strategy sessions where she walked Garrett through methodologies he later claimed to have developed. She even had moments captured almost accidentally. A video from an early client workshop where she explained a framework and Garrett said on camera, "This is brilliant, Mer. This is exactly what they need," before presenting that same framework 6 months later as his breakthrough insight. She organized it all chronologically, creating a timeline that was devastating in its clarity. Here was the idea in Meredith's research. Here was the first time Garrett referenced it. Here was when it appeared in his presentations. Here was when he started calling it his methodology. The pattern was undeniable. But documentation alone wasn't enough. Meredith understood that exposing Garrett's appropriation wouldn't be credible if it came across as a personal grievance, a bitter wife trying to take down her successful husband. She needed professional standing independent of him. She needed credibility that couldn't be dismissed as jealousy or score settling. That's what the academic work had been building. A professional identity that existed entirely separate from Garrett. A body of peer-reviewed scholarship that established her as a serious thinker. A reputation among people who valued intellectual honesty. So when the moment came to tell the truth, it would come from Dr. Meredith Hayes, established researcher, not from Mrs. Garrett Sullivan, scorned wife. The distinction mattered. 27 months after Garrett's book was published, Meredith received an email that changed the trajectory of everything. It was from Patricia Chen, the researcher who'd asked about attribution. She was putting together a special issue of a prestigious journal on collaborative authorship, intellectual property, and narrative erasure in professional partnerships. She wanted to know if Meredith would consider contributing a paper. Specifically, Patricia wrote, "I think there would be significant value in a case study examining how intellectual contributions become attributed to individuals in ways that don't reflect the actual origin of ideas. If you have thoughts on this topic, from either personal or professional experience, I believe it would make an important contribution to the field." The invitation was clear. Patricia was offering her a platform, an academically legitimate space to tell her story. Meredith stared at the email for 20 minutes. This was it. This was the moment she'd been preparing for without fully knowing she was preparing for it. She could write the paper. She could lay out the case, present the evidence, tell the truth about whose ideas had built Garrett's career. It would be published in a peer-reviewed journal, given academic legitimacy, made part of the permanent scholarly record. But doing so would detonate her marriage, would damage Garrett's reputation, possibly irreparably, would expose her own complicity in the erasure, the years she'd stayed silent. It would also, finally, make her visible. Meredith sat with the decision for 3 days. She thought about Janine's question from years ago. Do you ever feel invisible? She thought about the countless times she'd watched Garrett accept credit for work she'd done, acclaim for ideas she'd originated, recognition for brilliance that wasn't his. She thought about the dedication in his book. Who keeps the home fires burning while I pursue this mission? She thought about what her life would look like in 10 years and 20 years if she stayed silent. Would she become one of those women whose obituary mentions she supported her famous husband's work? Would her intellectual legacy be reduced to a footnote in someone else's story? On the fourth day, she replied to Patricia's email. I would be very interested in contributing to the special issue. I have a case study in mind that I believe would be valuable. A detailed examination of collaborative intellectual work and how attribution becomes systematically misallocated. I'll need several months to prepare the documentation properly. Patricia responded within an hour. Take all the time you need. This is important work. Meredith began writing that same evening. The paper took her 4 months to complete. She titled it On Collaborative Authorship and Narrative Erasure, a case study in intellectual property and partnership. She didn't name Garrett in the abstract or introduction, but the case study section laid out, in meticulous detail, a professional relationship between two collaborators. Partner A, an academic researcher with deep theoretical expertise. Partner B, a charismatic presenter with commercial instincts. The paper traced how ideas originated by Partner A were presented publicly by Partner B, how attribution slowly shifted from collaborative to individual, how the commercial success built on one person's intellectual labor became credited entirely to another person's public performance. She included anonymous excerpts from documentation, emails, dated drafts, comparative analysis of published research and commercial presentations, a timeline showing clear lineage of ideas from origin to appropriation. She changed identifying details just enough to maintain the pretense of anonymity. But anyone familiar with the Sullivan method and willing to look closely would recognize the case study immediately. More importantly, she included an appendix with full documentation, available upon request for verification purposes. Real emails, real dates, real names. If anyone questioned the validity of her case study, she could prove every single claim. The paper went through peer review. 2 reviewers accepted it with minor revisions. The third reviewer's comments were particularly striking. This is an important and unfortunately common dynamic in collaborative professional work, particularly in partnerships where one person provides intellectual foundations and another provides public performance. The documentation provided is exceptionally thorough. The case study reads as credible and well supported. My only concern is whether the anonymization is sufficient to protect the individuals involved, as the professional consequences of this exposure could be significant. However, that's ultimately the author's decision. The work itself is sound and valuable. I recommend acceptance. Meredith made the minor revisions. She did not strengthen the anonymization. The paper was accepted for publication. It would appear in print in 4 months, in a special issue that would be distributed to every major research library and academic institution, available in databases that journalists and fact-checkers regularly searched. Meredith informed Patricia that she was prepared to de-anonymize the case study if questions arose about its validity, that she had comprehensive documentation, that the individuals involved were real, the situation was real, and she was willing to stand behind every claim. Patricia had paused on their phone call. You understand what this means? Once it's public, once your name is attached to specific allegations of appropriation, there's no walking it back. I understand, Meredith said. I've understood for 3 years. I'm done being silent. The paper was scheduled for publication in October. In August, 2 months before publication, Garrett came home with news. He was being honored with the Lifetime Achievement Award in Organizational Development from the National Association of Professional Consultants. The award recognized pioneering contributions to the field and came with a significant cash prize and permanent induction into the Professional Hall of Honor. The selection committee had specifically cited his frameworks for organizational transformation, his innovative approaches to cultural change, his groundbreaking methodology for sustainable institutional development. All work that originated in Meredith's mind. Garrett was ecstatic. This is it, Mer. This is the recognition that establishes legacy. They're putting my methodology in the permanent record. Future consultants are going to study this work for decades. Meredith felt something cold and clear settle in her chest. "Your methodology," she said quietly. "Our methodology," Garrett corrected absently. "You know what I mean?" But he didn't mean that. He'd never meant that. In his mind, in the story he'd told himself so many times it had become indistinguishable from memory, the ideas were his. The frameworks were his. The brilliance was his. She'd been disappeared so completely that even in private, even in casual conversation, he claimed sole authorship without thinking about it. That night, Meredith sent an email to Patricia Chen. "I'm ready to de-anonymize the case study. Please prepare the paper for publication with my full name and full documentation. I want the appendix to include actual emails, actual dates, actual identities. No more anonymization. I want to tell the truth." Patricia called her the next morning. "Are you absolutely certain? The timing, with Sullivan's award announcement, this is going to look like retaliation." "It's not retaliation," Meredith said. "It's correction. The award is being given for work I created. The legacy being established is being attributed to the wrong person. If I stay silent now, his version becomes the permanent record." There was a long pause. "All right, I'll work with the journal editors. But Meredith, you should prepare yourself. This is going to create significant professional and personal consequences. I've been preparing for 3 years. The revised paper went through an expedited review process. The journal editors understood the implications and wanted to ensure everything was airtight. They verified her documentation, checked her sources, confirmed dates and authorship on published materials. Everything held up. The paper was scheduled for immediate online publication, ahead of the print issue, given its timeliness and significance. It went live on a Wednesday morning in September. Meredith was teaching a class when her phone started receiving notifications. Emails, messages, calls from numbers she didn't recognize. She ignored them until the class ended. Then she checked. The paper had been picked up immediately by academic news services. Then by professional organizations in the consulting and organizational development space. Then by journalists who covered business and workplace culture. The headline on one professional blog read, "Award-winning consultant's methodology built on wife's uncredited research, new paper alleges." Another read, "The invisible author behind the Sullivan method speaks." Her phone rang. It was Patricia. "The story is spreading faster than I anticipated. Several journalists have contacted the journal asking for your contact information. I haven't given it out, but you should probably prepare a statement." "I don't need a statement," Meredith said. "The paper is the statement." Her phone buzzed with an incoming call. "Garrett." She declined it. He called again. She declined again. Then a text message. "What did you do?" Another text. "People are sending me articles about intellectual property theft. They're citing a paper by someone named Meredith Hayes. Is this you? Did you publish something about us? Then, call me. Now." Meredith turned off her phone. She went to her office on campus, the small space that Garrett had never visited, didn't even know the location of. She sat in the chair by the window and waited. Within hours, the award committee would see the paper. They would begin asking Garrett questions about attribution and collaborative authorship. They would request documentation of how his methodology was developed. And Garrett would have nothing. No early drafts in his handwriting. No dated research notes. No published papers from before their collaboration. Nothing that proved original authorship. Because he wasn't the original author. He never had been. Meredith had given the world the truth. Now she would wait to see what the world did with it. Her phone, still turned off, sat silent on the desk. Outside the window, students walked across campus, laughing and talking, completely unaware that someone's entire professional identity was being quietly dismantled a few floors above them. Meredith felt no triumph, no satisfaction, no vindication, just a strange, weightless calm. The calm of someone who'd been holding their breath for years and had finally exhaled. She'd told the truth. The rest was no longer in her control. 24 hours later, Meredith turned her phone back on. 317 notifications appeared. Emails, texts, voicemails, missed calls. Most were from journalists requesting interviews. Several were from colleagues and former classmates who'd read the paper and wanted to express support. A few were from academic institutions asking if she'd be interested in speaking about collaborative authorship and attribution. And 47 were from Garrett. The messages escalated from confused to angry to desperate. "Call me. We need to talk. You're destroying everything we built. How could you do this? I can't believe you would sabotage our life like this. Please, Meredith, please call me." She read them all. She responded to none. Instead, she checked the professional news sites. The National Association of Professional Consultants had released a statement. In light of recent questions regarding attribution and collaborative authorship in the development of methodologies cited in our award selection, the committee is conducting a thorough review. We take matters of intellectual property and professional ethics seriously. The review process will be comprehensive and fair to all parties involved. Garrett had posted his own statement on social media. "I'm aware of recent allegations regarding the development of my professional methodologies. These questions arise from a complicated collaborative partnership with my spouse. I'm cooperating fully with the award committee's review, and am confident that a complete examination of our shared work will clarify the situation." Shared work. Collaborative partnership. Our methodologies. Even now, even faced with documented evidence, he was trying to maintain the narrative. Meredith opened her laptop and sent a single email to the award committee. "I appreciate your thorough review. I'm prepared to provide comprehensive documentation of the development timeline for all frameworks and methodologies cited in your award selection. This documentation includes dated research notes, published papers, email correspondence, and recorded strategy sessions showing clear authorship and chronology. I'm available to meet with the committee at your convenience." She attached a summary document. 50 pages of highlighted evidence. Timeline. Comparative analysis. Direct quotes from her early research alongside identical concepts in Garrett's presentations. It was undeniable. Overwhelming. Precise. She hit send. The next morning, Meredith received a call from the committee chair. "Dr. Hayes, we've reviewed your initial documentation. We'd like to schedule a formal interview. We'll also be interviewing Mr. Sullivan. This is an unprecedented situation, and we want to ensure we handle it with appropriate seriousness." Meredith agreed to the interview. The committee chair paused before ending the call. "Dr. Hayes, I want you to know I've read your academic book, the Theoretical Foundations text. It's excellent work, very rigorous, and the similarities to the commercial methodology are, quite frankly, striking." "Thank you," Meredith said. "We should have noticed this earlier. The connections between your scholarship and his commercial work. We should have asked questions about attribution before now." The validation felt distant but important. The interview was scheduled for the following week. In person, Meredith would present her full documentation. Garrett would be interviewed separately and given opportunity to provide his own evidence of authorship and development process. Meredith spent the week preparing, not the documentation, that was already comprehensive, but herself, her composure, her clarity. This was not about revenge. This was not about destroying Garrett. This was about truth, about establishing the accurate record, about ensuring that her intellectual legacy was attributed correctly. She practiced staying calm, factual, unemotional. The interview took 4 hours. 3 committee members asked detailed questions about every major framework in Garrett's methodology. Where had the ideas originated? When? What was the development process? How did the concepts migrate from her research to his presentations? Meredith walked them through everything. She showed them her doctoral research from 15 years ago, containing early versions of frameworks Garrett now claimed as breakthrough innovations. She showed them journal articles she'd published under her maiden name before their marriage. She showed them dated emails where she explained concepts to Garrett, using the exact language that later appeared in his materials. She showed them a video from an early client session where Garrett introduced her as the brilliant mind behind our approach, before he'd started taking sole credit. One committee member, a woman in her 60s who'd been mostly silent, finally spoke. "Dr. Hayes, why did you wait so long to address this?" Meredith had prepared for this question. "Because I believed that partnership meant supporting each other's success, even if recognition was uneven. I told myself that impact mattered more than credit. I convinced myself that being acknowledged privately was enough, even when public attribution went entirely to him. I made those choices for years, and then I realized that I'd erased myself so thoroughly that the permanent record would show none of my contributions, that my intellectual legacy would disappear entirely. and I decided that truth mattered more than protecting a narrative that was fundamentally false. The committee member nodded slowly. That took tremendous courage. It took tremendous desperation, Meredith corrected quietly. The committee met with Garrett 2 days later. Meredith didn't attend, but she heard through professional networks what happened. Garrett had been unable to provide substantive documentation of original authorship. His evidence consisted of presentation slides, published client case studies, and his book. All final products. Nothing showing the development process, the origin of ideas, the evolution of frameworks. When pressed for early drafts, research notes, or dated materials showing his intellectual process, he'd argued that he didn't work that way, that he developed ideas through conversation and iteration, not formal documentation, that trying to pinpoint who thought of what first in a marriage was impossible and inappropriate. The committee had asked about specific frameworks. Could he explain the theoretical foundations, the research that informed the models? Garrett had struggled. He was excellent at presenting ideas, at making them accessible and compelling. But he couldn't articulate the deeper theory. He couldn't explain where the concepts came from, what research traditions they drew on, what intellectual lineage they belonged to, because he didn't know. He'd never needed to know. He just needed to present what Meredith gave him. One committee member had apparently asked directly, "Mr. Sullivan, did you or did you not originate the framework cited in our award selection?" Garrett's answer had been telling. "My wife and I developed these frameworks collaboratively over many years of partnership. It's impossible to separate individual contributions in that kind of relationship. But the documentation shows Dr. Hayes publishing core concepts before your marriage, before you'd even met. How do you explain that?" Garrett hadn't had an answer. The committee deliberated for a week. Then they released their decision. After comprehensive review of documentation provided by both parties, the committee has determined that the methodologies cited in our award selection represent genuinely collaborative work, but with significantly greater intellectual origination from Dr. Meredith Hayes than was previously understood or publicly acknowledged. In recognition of this finding, we are revising the award to honor both Dr. Meredith Hayes and Mr. Garrett Sullivan for their collaborative development of transformative frameworks in organizational psychology. The statement continued. We acknowledge that Dr. Hayes's contributions have been insufficiently recognized in public discourse and commercial applications of this work. We encourage the professional community to ensure accurate attribution of intellectual contributions in collaborative partnerships. Meredith read the statement 3 times. It wasn't everything. They'd stopped short of saying Garrett had engaged in appropriation. They'd framed it as collaborative work with uneven attribution rather than outright theft. But it was something. It was public acknowledgement. It was her name added to the permanent record. It was the truth, or at least a version of the truth that the committee felt comfortable stating publicly. Her phone rang. Garrett. She answered this time. Meredith, we need to talk. The committee wants to give us a joint award. This can still work. We can accept it together, present ourselves as a collaborative team. Salvage this situation. His voice was strained, desperate. I'm willing to accept the joint recognition, Meredith said quietly. You can make your own decision about whether to participate. There was a long silence. If I decline, it looks like I'm admitting wrongdoing. Like I stole your work. You did steal my work, Garrett. Not violently. Not with malicious intent. But you took ideas I created and presented them as yours. You erased me from the narrative so completely that you started believing the erasure yourself. That's what happened. That's the truth. That's not, Garrett started, then stopped. His breathing was ragged. This is going to destroy my reputation. Everything I've built. Clients are already asking questions. Some are threatening to pull contracts. Then maybe you should accept a joint award. Acknowledge the collaboration. Tell the truth about how the work was actually developed. Another long silence. I can't. If I accept shared credit after years of sole attribution, it confirms every allegation. It ends my career. Then decline. But I'm accepting, with or without you. She could hear him crying. Quiet, desperate sounds. Meredith, please. Please don't do this. We can fix this privately. I'll acknowledge you more in future work. I'll make sure you're credited. Just retract the paper. Tell the committee it was a misunderstanding. And there it was. The final boundary. The ultimate test. Garrett was asking her to re-erase herself. To prioritize his comfort over the truth. To sacrifice her visibility for his reputation. To disappear again. "No," Meredith said. "I'm done disappearing." She ended the call. Garrett declined the award 3 days later. His statement read, "After careful consideration, I've decided to decline the recognition at this time. My wife and I are addressing complicated questions about attribution in our collaborative work, and I don't feel it's appropriate to accept individual honors while those questions remain unresolved." The professional community responded with speculation and judgment. Some people praised Garrett for his integrity in declining. Others saw the decline as admission of guilt. Most people just wanted to know what had really happened. The answer was in Meredith's paper, available to anyone willing to read it. The award ceremony was scheduled for 6 weeks later. Meredith was invited to attend and accept the recognition in her own name, since Garrett had declined and the documentation showed her primary authorship. She said yes. The weeks between Garrett's decline and the ceremony were surreal. Professional publications ran retrospective pieces examining the Sullivan method and its origins. Several journalists tracked down Meredith's earlier academic publications and compared them to Garrett's commercial materials. The similarities were covered in detailed side-by-side analyses. One article headline read, "The Scholar Behind the Method, How Dr. Meredith Hayes' Research Became Garrett Sullivan's Brand." Another interviewed former clients who remembered early presentations where Garrett had introduced Meredith as his intellectual partner, before she'd gradually disappeared from the narrative. Public opinion was divided. Some people were outraged on Meredith's behalf, seeing her story as emblematic of how women's intellectual labor is systematically erased. Others were more sympathetic to Garrett, arguing that attribution in collaborative work is always complicated, that marriages make intellectual property questions messy. A few people blamed Meredith for not speaking up sooner, for complicity in her own erasure, for weaponizing the truth at the moment it would cause maximum damage. Meredith read very little of it. She'd told the truth. The public interpretation was beyond her control. What mattered to her was simpler. Her name was in the record now. Future researchers studying these frameworks would find her publications, her book, her paper. They would know she existed. They would know where the ideas came from. She would not be a footnote. She would not be the wife who kept the home fires burning. She would be Dr. Meredith Hayes, whose theoretical work on organizational transformation became the foundation for significant practical methodologies. That was enough. Garrett called her one more time, the night before the ceremony. "I just want you to know. You've destroyed everything. The business is falling apart. Clients are leaving. My reputation is ruined. Everything we built together you've demolished for your ego." His voice was hollow, defeated. Meredith felt something that might have been pity and might have been grief. "I didn't destroy what we built, Garrett. I just told the truth about who built it. If your reputation can't survive the truth, that's not my failure. That's yours. Do you feel good about this? Do you feel vindicated? I feel visible, which is different, but it's enough." She hung up. The next morning, she drove to the ceremony alone. The ballroom held maybe 300 people, professionals in organizational development, academics, consultants, researchers. People who worked in the spaces between theory and practice, between ideas and implementation. Meredith sat in the audience during the other awards, the networking sessions, the keynote address. Several people approached her to introduce themselves. Some offered support. Some asked careful questions about collaborative attribution. Some just wanted to meet the person they'd read about. She was gracious with all of them. Calm, composed. When her award was announced, she walked to the stage with steady steps. The committee chair gave a brief introduction. Dr. Meredith Hayes is being recognized for pioneering theoretical contributions to our understanding of organizational transformation. Her frameworks have influenced both academic research and practical applications in significant and lasting ways. We honor not only her intellectual contributions, but her courage in ensuring those contributions are accurately attributed. Meredith accepted the award and stepped to the microphone. She'd prepared brief remarks. Not about Garrett, not about the appropriation, not about revenge or vindication, about something more fundamental. "Thank you for this recognition. I want to speak briefly about invisible labor and collaborative work. Many of us work in partnerships where one person provides intellectual foundations and another provides public performance. Both roles are valuable. Translation matters. Accessibility matters. The ability to take complex ideas and make them useful to broader audiences is a genuine skill. But translation should not erase authorship. Accessibility should not require invisibility. Partnership should make both people more visible, not less. I spent years telling myself that impact mattered more than credit. That being needed was the same as being valued. That devotion meant not requiring recognition. I was wrong. Being erased from the narrative of work you created is not humility, it's harm. And staying silent about that harm does not make you generous. It makes you complicit in your own disappearance. If you're in a collaborative partnership where your contributions are consistently attributed to someone else, I want you to hear this. You are not being petty by wanting acknowledgement. You are not being competitive by expecting credit. You are not being difficult by asking to exist in the story. You deserve to be visible. Your work deserves to be attributed accurately. Your intellectual legacy deserves to be preserved in your name. I hope this recognition encourages all of us to be more careful about attribution, more honest about collaboration, and more committed to ensuring that the people who generate ideas receive credit for generating them. Thank you. The applause was substantial. Not polite recognition, but genuine response. Afterward, several women approached Meredith privately. One of them said, "I've been the invisible partner in my research collaboration for 6 years. After hearing you speak, I'm going to have a conversation with my CO author about attribution on our next publication." Another said, "My husband presents my insights as his own in his consulting work. I've never said anything because I didn't want to seem petty. But you're right. I'm disappearing. And I need to stop participating in that." Meredith listened to their stories and felt the weight of recognition, not just being recognized herself, but recognizing a pattern that extended far beyond her personal experience. This wasn't just about her and Garrett. It was about a systematic dynamic where some people's intellectual contributions became attributed to others, where certain kinds of labor were made invisible, where the people who generated ideas were erased from the stories of those ideas. She'd told her truth. And in doing so, she'd given other people language for their own experiences. That felt more significant than any award. Meredith left the ceremony early, avoiding the dinner and networking that would follow. She drove home through autumn evening light, the award sitting on the passenger seat beside her. Home was no longer the house she'd shared with Garrett. She'd moved out 6 weeks ago, into a small apartment near the university where she now taught full-time. The apartment was sparse. A few pieces of furniture, books, her desk by the window. The life she was building felt small compared to what she'd left behind. But it was hers. Every single piece of it was hers. She set the award on a shelf, made tea, sat by the window, and watched darkness settle over the city. Her phone buzzed. A text from Janine. "I'm so proud of you. You took up space. You chose yourself. You refused to disappear. That took everything." Meredith typed back. "I know. I'm still not sure it was worth what it cost." Janine's response came immediately. "Ask me again in 5 years. I think you'll feel differently." Maybe. Meredith hoped that was true. She finished her tea and opened her laptop. She had a paper to review for a colleague, a dissertation committee meeting to prepare for, a research project to plan, work that was hers, ideas that would be attributed to her, a professional identity that existed independent of anyone else's story. It was enough. For now, it was enough. Outside the window, the city lights came on, one by one, making patterns in the darkness. Meredith turned on her desk lamp and got to work. Script writing. Part 3. 6 months passed. Meredith settled into a rhythm that felt nothing like her old life and everything like a life that actually belonged to her. She taught 3 courses at the university: advanced organizational psychology, research methods, collaborative knowledge creation. The students were bright and challenging and unimpressed by reputation. They cared about ideas, not about who was famous. It was refreshing in ways Meredith hadn't anticipated. She published regularly now, always under her own name. Her work was cited in dissertations and referenced in academic conferences. Not widely known, not commercially successful, but respected in the circles that valued intellectual rigor. The business she and Garrett had built together dissolved slowly and painfully. Some clients stayed with Garrett, willing to overlook the attribution controversy or simply not caring as long as the methodologies worked. Some left entirely uncomfortable with the ethical questions. A few reached out to Meredith directly, asking if she was available for consultation. She took on 3 clients. Small projects. universities and nonprofits that valued her theoretical depth over commercial polish. The work paid enough to supplement her academic salary, and more importantly, it felt clean. No performance, no erasure, just her expertise, honestly offered and properly credited. The divorce was finalized in early spring. Garrett had wanted to fight over assets, over intellectual property rights, over the business, but his attorney had apparently advised him that drawing attention to questions of authorship and ownership would only reinforce the public narrative he was trying to escape. They settled quietly. Meredith took her retirement accounts, her car, and full rights to all frameworks and methodologies she could document as originating from her research. Garrett kept the house, the business name, and the clients who still wanted to work with him. She signed the papers in an attorney's office on a Tuesday morning and felt nothing. No grief. No relief. Just completion. That afternoon, she went back to campus and taught her seminar on power dynamics and collaborative relationships. The irony was not lost on her. She lived alone now in an apartment that got good morning light. It was smaller than the house she'd shared with Garrett, quieter, simpler. She'd brought very little with her when she moved out. Books, clothes, her desk, the files that mattered. Starting over at 42 felt both terrifying and oddly liberating. She didn't have to coordinate her schedule with anyone else's priorities. Didn't have to perform supportiveness or manage someone else's emotional landscape. Didn't have to watch her words or soften her opinions or make herself smaller. She could just exist at full volume in her own life. Some days that felt like freedom, other days it felt like loneliness so profound she could barely breathe through it. But even on the lonely days, Meredith never once wished she'd stayed silent. Because silence would have meant spending the rest of her life watching someone else receive credit for work she'd done. It would have meant her intellectual legacy disappearing entirely. It would have meant teaching students about the importance of attribution while living as a walking contradiction. She'd chosen visibility over comfort, truth over peace, dignity over devotion. The cost had been enormous, but the alternative would have cost her something she couldn't afford to lose. Herself. Meredith received occasional updates about Garrett through professional networks. He'd moved to a different city, rebuilt a smaller consulting practice, remarried someone who worked in marketing and had no background in organizational development. Good, Meredith thought when she heard. Let him build a life with someone who doesn't threaten his narrative. Someone who can admire him without complicating his self-concept. She didn't wish him harm. She didn't think about him much at all anymore. He'd become someone she used to know. Someone she'd loved once, before she understood what that love was costing her. On a Thursday morning in late March, Meredith sat in her office during student hours. A doctoral candidate knocked on her open door. Dr. Hayes, do you have a few minutes? I wanted to ask about something in my dissertation. Of course. Come in. The student, a woman named Sarah in her late 20s, sat down and pulled out a draft chapter. I'm writing about collaborative knowledge creation in organizational contexts, and I've been citing your theoretical framework pretty extensively. The one from your book. Meredith nodded. That's fine. What's your question? Sarah hesitated. I also looked at some of the commercial applications of similar frameworks, particularly the Sullivan method, because it's so widely used in practice. And I noticed that the theoretical foundations are essentially identical to your work, but the attribution is completely different. I wanted to ask how to handle that in my literature review. Do I cite them as parallel developments, or is there a connection I should acknowledge? Meredith smiled slightly. This was happening more often now. Researchers noticing the similarities, asking careful questions about attribution and origin. There's a connection. The commercial methodology was developed based on my theoretical frameworks. If you want the full story, there's a paper I published 2 years ago on collaborative authorship and narrative erasure. It lays out the relationship in detail. Sarah's eyes widened. Oh, I didn't realize. So when I'm citing the theoretical foundations, I should be citing your work as the origin point, not the commercial applications? That would be accurate, yes. Sarah made notes, then looked up again. Can I ask you something that might be too personal? You can ask. I'll decide if I want to answer. How did you find the courage to publish that paper? To tell the truth publicly when you knew what it would cost you? Meredith was quiet for a moment, considering. I didn't feel courageous. I felt desperate. I'd reached a point where staying silent was costing me more than speaking up would cost. I was disappearing and I couldn't afford to disappear any further. But weren't you afraid of the consequences? The professional backlash? The personal cost? Terrified. But I was more afraid of spending the rest of my life as a footnote in someone else's story. More afraid of teaching students like you about intellectual integrity while living a lie. More afraid of the person I was becoming by staying silent. Sarah nodded slowly. I think I needed to hear that. I'm in a research partnership where my contributions keep getting minimized. Not erased, but definitely undervalued. And I keep telling myself it's not worth making an issue about. Meredith leaned forward. Can I tell you something I wish someone had told me 15 years ago? Please. If you document nothing else in your academic career, document your contributions. Keep dated records. Save emails. Preserve drafts. Create a paper trail of your intellectual work. Not because you're planning to expose anyone, but because memory is unreliable and people will rewrite history to match the story they need to believe about themselves. Protect your legacy by documenting it. Sarah was writing this down. That's really practical advice. And one more thing. Being collaborative doesn't mean being invisible. Being generous doesn't mean being erased. Partnership should make both people more visible, not less. If your collaboration requires your disappearance, it's not collaboration, it's exploitation. Sarah looked up from her notes. Even if the other person doesn't mean to exploit you? Especially then. Because unintentional erasure is the most insidious kind. It's harder to name, harder to fight, easier to convince yourself you're being petty for noticing. But erasure is erasure. Intent doesn't change impact. Sarah thanked her and left. Meredith watched her walk down the hallway and hoped the conversation would matter. Hoped Sarah would protect herself in ways Meredith hadn't known to protect herself. That evening, Meredith received an email that surprised her. It was from a journalist working on a long-form piece about gender dynamics in intellectual labor, the ways women's contributions are systematically made invisible in collaborative work. She wanted to interview Meredith as someone who'd challenged that dynamic publicly. Meredith had declined most interview requests over the past 2 years. She'd told her story in the paper and the awards speech. She didn't need to keep relitigating it publicly. But this felt different. Not about her and Garrett specifically, but about the broader pattern. About helping other people recognize the dynamic before they lost decades to it. She agreed to the interview. They met at a coffee shop near campus. The journalist, a woman in her 30s named Rachel, had clearly done extensive research. She'd read Meredith's paper, her book, Garrett's materials, professional commentary on the situation. I want to be clear about my angle, Rachel said. This isn't a hit piece on your ex-husband. It's about a systemic issue. The invisible labor problem. How certain people's intellectual contributions get attributed to others, and what it takes to challenge that. That sounds right, Meredith said. Rachel asked thoughtful questions. Not about the drama, not about the marriage, but about the mechanisms of erasure. How it happened gradually. Why Meredith participated in it for so long. What finally made silence impossible. What changed after she spoke up. Meredith answered honestly. I think I believed that being needed was the same as being valued. That if I was essential to the work, it didn't matter whether I was visible in the story. But being needed without being acknowledged is just being used, even if nobody intends it that way. Rachel nodded, taking notes. What do you want people to take away from your experience? That you can be collaborative and still require credit. That you can be generous and still demand acknowledgement. That you can be devoted to shared work and still insist on being visible. Those things aren't contradictory. And if someone tells you they are, they're protecting a system that benefits from your erasure. The piece was published 6 weeks later in a major magazine. It was sensitive, well-researched, thoughtful. It used Meredith's story as an entry point, but expanded to interview other women in similar situations. Scientists whose discoveries were credited to male lab directors. Writers whose ideas were presented by more prominent colleagues. Businesswomen whose strategies were implemented by male executives who claimed credit. The pattern was everywhere once you knew to look for it. The article created renewed interest in Meredith's work. Her academic book had a small resurgence in sales. She was invited to speak at conferences, not about her personal situation but about collaborative attribution, intellectual property in partnerships, recognition dynamics in professional relationships. She accepted some invitations and declined others. She was building a career as an expert on these dynamics, but she was careful not to let it consume her identity entirely. She was more than her experience of erasure. She was a scholar, a teacher, a researcher with ideas that extended far beyond her personal story. On a Sunday morning in early summer, Meredith went for a long walk through the park near her apartment. The weather was perfect. Warm but not hot. Trees fully green. Families picnicking. Dogs running. The ordinary beauty of a day that didn't require anything from her. She sat on a bench and watched people live their lives. A couple throwing a frisbee. An elderly woman feeding ducks. A father teaching his daughter to ride a bike. For the first time in years, Meredith felt something close to peace. Not happiness exactly. Not triumph. Not vindication. Just presence. Uncomplicated existence in her own life. She was visible now, in the record and in the world. Her work was attributed to her. Her ideas carried her name. Her legacy would reflect her actual contributions. She paid an enormous price for that visibility. Her marriage, her financial security, the shared life she'd built. The comfort of being part of a partnership, even a flawed one. But she'd gained something that turned out to be worth more than all of that. She'd gained herself back. The self that existed independent of being needed. The self that could occupy space without apologizing. The self that expected acknowledgement as a basic requirement rather than an optional courtesy. Meredith pulled out her phone and opened her email. A doctoral student from another university had written asking if she'd consider serving on a dissertation committee, exploring power dynamics and collaborative knowledge work. She wrote back, "I'd be honored. Please send me the proposal and we'll set up a time to discuss." She signed the email Dr. Meredith Hayes and felt the simple satisfaction of a name that fully belonged to her. The sun shifted, warming the bench where she sat. Meredith closed her eyes and let herself just be, not achieving, not proving, not performing, just existing in the quiet center of her own reconstructed life. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything she'd been fighting for without knowing how to name it. Visibility, dignity, presence, self. She stayed on that bench for another hour, watching the world move around her, finally at peace with her place in it. Not in the margins, not in the footnotes, not in someone else's story. Right here, at the center of her own. The narrator's voice shifts now, becoming more direct, more intimate. Speaking not as someone telling Meredith's story, but as someone speaking to you about what her story means. If you've made it this far, you've spent the last hour with Meredith. You've watched her disappear into devotion and fight her way back to visibility. You've seen the cost of silence and the cost of speaking. You've witnessed what happens when someone finally chooses themselves after years of choosing everyone else. But here's what I want you to understand. Meredith's story isn't special because it's rare. It's important because it's common. Right now, someone is sitting in a meeting watching their idea come out of someone else's mouth. Someone is reading an acknowledgement that groups them with the assistant and the editor when they created the entire foundation. Someone is being told they're being petty for wanting credit, competitive for expecting recognition, difficult for refusing to disappear. Maybe that someone is you. And if it is, I need you to hear something clearly. You are not being humble by accepting invisibility. You are not being collaborative by allowing erasure. You are not being loving by disappearing into someone else's story. You are participating in your own deletion. And the person who benefits from that deletion, even if they love you, even if they need you, even if they genuinely believe they're crediting you appropriately, that person is not your partner. They're the audience for a performance of selflessness that's costing you everything. Here's what Meredith learned that you need to know. Devotion and boundaries are not opposites. You can be fully committed to a partnership and still require acknowledgement. You can be generous with your ideas and still demand credit. You can support someone else's success and still insist on visibility for your own contributions. In fact, real partnership requires all of those things. Because partnership without acknowledgement isn't partnership. It's absorption. And absorption, no matter how loving it feels, is a form of erasure. So what do you do if you're in Meredith's situation? If you're the brilliant mind behind someone else's success? If you're the invisible architect of someone else's empire? First, start documenting. Not because you're planning exposure, but because you're establishing reality. When you have an idea, write it down with a date. When you create a framework, keep the original draft. When someone takes credit for your thinking, don't immediately explain it away. Notice it. Record it. Create a paper trail of your existence. Because here's the truth about memory. It's unreliable, and people will rewrite history to match the story they need to believe about themselves. The person taking credit for your work will eventually believe they originated it. They'll forget the conversations where you walked them through your thinking. They'll misremember the development process. They'll genuinely convince themselves the ideas were theirs. Documentation protects you from that amnesia. It preserves the truth when memory fails. Second, practice visibility. Practice saying, I created that. I developed that approach. That was my idea. Notice how it feels in your body to claim your work instead of deflecting credit. Notice who celebrates when you take up space and who gets uncomfortable. Notice whether the people around you support your visibility or subtly punish it. The people who genuinely value you want you to be seen. The people who need you to be invisible have built their comfort on your erasure. That distinction matters. Third, understand that leaving or speaking up or demanding acknowledgement is not betrayal. It's honesty. You're not destroying what you built together by telling the truth about who built it. You're correcting a narrative that was always incomplete. And yes, that correction will have consequences. Meredith lost her marriage, her financial security, her social circle. Speaking truth cost her enormously. But staying silent would have cost her something irreplaceable. Her identity, her legacy, herself. You have to decide which cost you can afford to pay. But please understand this. The cost of silence accumulates over time. Every day you stay invisible, you're trading pieces of yourself for someone else's comfort. Eventually, you'll have traded so much that you won't recognize who you are anymore. Meredith waited 3 years before speaking. You might need more time. You might need less. There's no perfect timeline for reclaiming yourself. But every day you choose visibility over invisibility is a day you're building a self that can exist independently of being needed. And that matters more than you know, because here's the thing about being needed. It feels good. It feels like love. It feels like you're essential, valuable, important. But being needed is not the same as being valued. You can be absolutely essential to someone's success while being completely erased from the story of that success. Meredith was essential to Garrett. He couldn't have built his career without her thinking, her frameworks, her intellectual labor. But he didn't value her enough to acknowledge her publicly. He needed her utility but didn't honor her identity. If you're in that situation, ask yourself this. Does the person who needs you also see you? Do they acknowledge your contributions publicly, not just privately? Do they celebrate your visibility or only your usefulness? Those questions will tell you whether you're in a partnership or a performance. Here's what I hope you take from Meredith's story. The opposite of devotion is not selfishness. It's boundaries. The opposite of invisibility is not arrogance. It's presence. The opposite of erasure is not revenge. It's truth. And telling the truth about your contributions, your value, your existence, that's not vanity, that's survival. Meredith survived by refusing to disappear completely, by documenting her existence, by building an identity outside the relationship that erased her, by choosing truth when silence became unbearable. You can survive that way too. You can document your work. You can build visibility. You can set boundaries around credit and acknowledgement. You can demand to exist in the stories you help create. You can choose yourself without apology, without guilt, without shame. Because you deserve to be seen. Your work deserves to be credited. Your legacy deserves to be preserved in your name. Not because you're better than anyone else, but because you exist. And existence deserves acknowledgement. Meredith learned that lesson the hard way. She spent a decade disappearing before she understood that visibility wasn't optional. That being seen wasn't vanity. That claiming her work wasn't competitiveness. It was just honesty. Basic, fundamental honesty about who created what, and who contributed what, and whose thinking built the foundation everyone else was standing on. You deserve that honesty too. In your relationships, in your work, in your partnerships, in your collaborations. You deserve to exist at full volume in your own life. You deserve to have your name attached to your ideas. You deserve to be acknowledged for the brilliance you contribute. And if the people around you can't handle your visibility, if they need you to stay small so they can feel big, then they don't deserve access to your gifts. Let that sink in. The people who love you want you to be seen. The people who need you to be invisible are using you. even if they don't mean to, even if they love you, even if they genuinely believe they're crediting you appropriately. If your contributions are consistently attributed to someone else, that's not collaboration, that's erasure. And you don't have to accept it. Meredith stopped accepting it. She told the truth. She reclaimed her legacy. She chose visibility over comfort, dignity over devotion, self over silence. It cost her everything she thought she needed, and gave her back the only thing that actually belonged to her, herself. You can make that choice too. Maybe not today, maybe not this year. But eventually, if you're living in someone else's story, you're going to have to decide whether to stay invisible or fight for presence. When that moment comes, remember Meredith. Remember that speaking up is not betrayal. That documentation is not paranoia. That visibility is not vanity. Remember that you are allowed to exist. Fully, loudly, undeniably. You are allowed to take up space, to claim your work, to demand acknowledgement, to refuse erasure. You are allowed to choose yourself. Even when it costs you everything. Even when people call you selfish. Even when you lose relationships that required your invisibility to function. You are allowed to be seen. And that permission doesn't come from anyone else. It comes from you. From the simple, revolutionary decision to stop participating in your own disappearance. Meredith made that decision. And yes, it was hard. Yes, it was costly. Yes, she lost things that mattered. But she gained something irreplaceable. She gained herself back. And in the end, that was the only thing that truly belonged to her. It's the only thing that truly belongs to you too. Yourself, your identity, your legacy, your voice. Protect it, document it, honor it, claim it. Don't wait until you've disappeared so completely that reclaiming yourself feels impossible. Don't stay silent until your contributions are so thoroughly attributed to someone else that the truth sounds like revisionism. Start now. Today, this moment. Notice when you're making yourself smaller. Notice when you're deflecting credit. Notice when you're explaining away erasure. Notice when you're performing invisibility. And then make a different choice. A small choice. Say, that was my idea. Write down your contribution. Correct the misattribution. Claim the credit. Build visibility one small act at a time. Until being seen feels normal instead of frightening. Until acknowledgement feels like a basic requirement instead of an optional courtesy. Until you exist at full volume in your own life without apology. That's what Meredith did. That's what you can do too. And when you do, when you choose visibility over silence, presence over erasure, self over sacrifice, you'll discover something Meredith discovered. You are enough, just as you are, without making yourself smaller, without disappearing into devotion, without erasing yourself for someone else's comfort. You are enough. You always were. You just forgot while you were busy making everyone else bigger. It's time to remember. It's time to reclaim. It's time to be seen. Your story matters. Your contributions matter. Your existence matters. Don't let anyone, not even someone you love, convince you otherwise. Be visible. Be present. Be yourself. Fully. Unapologetically. Undeniably. The world needs what you have to offer too much for you to spend your life making someone else look good. Meredith learned that. Now you know it too. What you do with that knowledge is up to you. But whatever you choose, choose yourself. Choose truth. Choose visibility. Choose to exist. Because you deserve to be seen. And the story that needs to be told more than anything else is yours. Stories like Meredith's unfold every single day in quiet offices and prestigious institutions and partnerships that look perfect from the outside. They're stories about the people who build the foundations while others accept the awards. Stories about the brilliant minds behind someone else's success. Stories about what it costs to be invisible and what it takes to reclaim your voice. If Meredith's journey resonated with you, if you saw yourself in her silence or her awakening or her choice to finally speak, you're not alone. This is exactly what we explore here at Silent Mind Stories. We tell the stories of people who found their voice after years of silence, who reclaimed their identity after years of erasure, who chose truth even when it cost them everything they thought they needed, who refused to disappear even when disappearing was easier. These aren't simple revenge stories where good defeats evil and justice is clean and obvious. These are complex, nuanced explorations of power and recognition, devotion and identity, silence and voice. Stories that honor the messiness of real human experience while revealing the deeper patterns underneath our choices. Every week, we bring you new stories, different characters, different betrayals, different reckonings, but always the same fundamental questions. What happens when silence becomes complicity? When does devotion become self-erasure? How do you reclaim an identity you've spent years dismantling? What does it cost to tell the truth when everyone around you has invested in the lie? If you want to keep exploring these questions, if you want more stories that reveal the hidden dynamics of power and acknowledgement, that honor the people who've been made invisible, that examine the courage it takes to choose visibility, subscribe to Silent Mind Stories. Join a community of people who understand that silence isn't always peace, that devotion isn't always love, that the most powerful reclamation often happens quietly, with dignity rather than drama. We're building something here for those of us who've been invisible too long, who've given too much of ourselves away, who've loved so selflessly we forgot we were supposed to exist too. These stories are mirrors and roadmaps. They're warnings and encouragement. They remind us we're not alone in our experience, and they show us that choosing ourselves isn't betrayal. It's the only honest path forward. Click subscribe. Join us. Let's keep telling the stories that matter. The ones about ordinary people who found extraordinary courage, not in revenge, but in the simple, revolutionary act of refusing to disappear. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for believing that your story, your voice, your presence matter enough to protect. Welcome to Silent Mind Stories.